Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion. Thank you for joining us today for our event entitled Ardeshir Mohassess, Art, Absurdity, and Politics. As you might know, this panel discussion will also be live at Ardeshir Mohassess YouTube channel, and later on will be uploaded on YouTube. This panel discussion is organized by Kaarnamaa Institute of Art and Visual Culture in collaboration with the Ardeshir Mohassess Trust. My name is Raha Khademi, and I'm a senior editor at Kaarnamaa Institute of Art and Visual Culture. We're thrilled today to be joined by Professor Sussan Babaie, Professor Nahid Mozaffari, and Mr. Vali Mahlouji as our three panelists. Before we start, I just would like to point out to the fact that while we are having this panel discussion, Iranian women are at the front lines of fighting against the brutality of the totalitarian regime of Iran. It's an important moment for all of us to say no to the systemic gender apartheid of Iran, loud and clear. I would like to introduce our panelists briefly. I will start with Dr. Sussan Babaie. Sussan Babaie is a professor in arts of Iran and Islam. Her areas of research span a wide range, but are mostly informed by an emphasis on transdisciplinary and transcultural approaches to the making of art, a specialist on early modern Safavi Persia/Iran, with topics on urbanism and empire studies and on sexuality and social habits of seeing. Dr. Babaie also writes on contemporary arts of Iran. Her current book project is on food and art, exploring the link between taste and seeing. Dr. Babaie is the co-curator of an exhibition on art and the Great Mongol State at the Royal Academy. Dr. Nahid Mozaffari is currently a senior research fellow at the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies at Leipzig University. She has taught at the Departments of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, Paris, and at the New School for Social Research. Her publications include Crafting Constitutionalism, an Iranian secular modernist project, Visions of Secularity in Constitutional Iran, and Strange Times, My Dear, the Pen Anthology of Contemporary Iranian Literature. Dr. Mozaffari is currently completing an edited volume entitled Multiple Histories of Slavery in Qajar, Iran. Mr. Vali Mahlouji is an art curator, founder of the nonprofit platform Archaeology of the Final Decade, advisor to the British Museum, and director of Kaveh Golestan Estate. Mahlouji is a member of Art Dubai Modern Advisory Committee and a board member of Bahman Mohassess Estate. Mahlouji works with international and public art institutions and facilitates acquisitions for the museums such as Tate Modern, the British Museum, etc. Okay, before we start, I would like to briefly talk a little bit about the structure of our session. As you know, we will have three different sections. We will start with a lecture by Dr. Babaie. After that, the first lecture will be followed by the lecture by Dr. Mozaffari. And after that, Vali Mahlouji, we will have a discussion on the discussed topics. We predict each of these sessions be 20 minutes. And then after that, we will expand on the discussed topics for another 20 minutes. In the last half an hour of the session, there will be room for Q&A session. And of course, our audience, we will have the opportunity to ask their questions. So I guess that's for me, that's for my part. And I think we can continue with you, Professor Babaie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can see my screen. Am I correct?
Yes, I can see that perfectly.
Okay, I got to go back to the beginning. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and speaking about the work of Ardeshir Mohassess through my lens of research, essentially. My task has been to think in terms of the place of Mohassess's work within the cultural background, if you will, or visual background of his work within the Iranian history of painting, in particular painting and drawings. This is I'm not a Mohassess specialist, actually, so I'm learning along the way, and I'm delighted and have discovered a great deal of material along the way, which are extraordinary, of course, as this is the work of really an unusual, extraordinary artist. One of the key aspects that interests me in terms of his work is, in fact, not only the social commentary, the satirical view that he brings to the visual and to his context, which is something to be discussed, of course. It's not a given, in fact. In other words, that aspect itself, which dominates the literature on Mohassess's work, remains unquestioned. And I think there is need for thinking freshly about some of these issues. But what my interest is to look at a few of his work, not this voluminous output of his, but a few selectively, and I admit it is selective, to think in terms of the ways in which we come to ask questions and to consider different ways of looking at the work. One of the issues that has interested me in searching and researching the topic has been the difficulty of access to his works, and in fact, the absence of a full representation of the works in a broader context, both in terms of how they look, that is the piece of paper with ink and inks and pen or marks of pen or brush, depending on what he had used. In other words, the materiality of the objects are missing in general. The other one has to do with the way in which isolated images are often presented, leaving me, for instance, to ponder whether this image of the work on the left-hand side is in fact without the background or with that background that we see in this in these two images here. What I'd like to consider is Mohassess, the way Mohassess is studied, which is primarily for the political content and iconography of his work, isolating those aspects from everything else in his life's work. Is he an illustrator? What is an illustrator, actually? This goes back to thinking in terms of, for instance, the traditions of Persian painting, where people oftentimes, especially in Western sort of literature, the painting is referred to as manuscript illustration rather than as a manuscript or part of a manuscript, as an integral part of an object, in fact. An illustrator has connotations which are worth thinking about. Is he a satirist through his images? But if can one think of it in terms of, or the images as words? Is that the way one should look at his images? And then the other side of the readings of his life work oftentimes focus on the fascinating life story, the tragic exile, and of course his illness at the end of his life. in a way, Mohassess has often been seen through the lens of a social anthropologist or an ethnographer and a commentator, as if that is the fullness of what his output is. And I'm not saying that is wrong, I'm only questioning if that is complete, in fact. In other words, in the end, the biggest question in my mind is the fact that we need to, in fact, open up this arena of work on Mohassess, completely making it available in terms of documents and images and works of art, in order to, in fact, reevaluate his work. And then I basically take two positions here, one of which, or in this presentation, just in favor of the time that I have. One has to do with his work in relation to history of modern Iranian art through close looking, actually, and taking forms and style as a language distinct from words. In other words, making an effort to divert from a logocentric approach to the work of Mohassess and many other of the contemporary, modern and contemporary artists, in fact, to think about the access to the works and what that full representation of the works might in fact tell us. In other words, the pictures that I show you oftentimes are represented in isolated, sort of blotted out images of the reclining figure or the standing figure and so forth, rather than as the full picture or full pages. This kind of close looking and the each work taken as an object with its full materiality also makes us think a little bit more about the historical visual reference, the kinds of things that we find in Mohassess's work, which are familiar in terms of an image repertoire, which evoke intersecting worlds of a collective history, visual history, and bringing those into the present, which, looking at the work or the range of work of Mohassess, at least tells me that he was very self-consciously looking at these historical pasts. How he was doing it, what are his sources, are issues that need to be, in fact, studied further. And these as subjects of or representations of a modernity that is more than the subject matter. In other words, my point is that just the attention, or the deep and focused and abiding attention on the political implications, the satirical dimensions of his work, may in fact divert us from a fuller understanding of what his work has done. It's clear to me that when we look at his work, such as the one from 1986, that he was indeed harvesting, if you will, a long history of image making in Iran from, for instance, paintings that come from manuscripts such as the Shahnameh, which you see at the lower level, where Solomon is enthroned, that image of a Solomonic figure, the king enthroned, that is part of the visual repertoire of Persian arts, including photography, such as Sevrogan's photograph of Nasiruddin Shah in front of the peacock throne. That he was alert to this larger history is one of those issues that I particularly will be addressing, at least in passing, briefly, as it were. The other thing I wanted to point to was this advocacy for style as a language all on its own. In other words, this is his language, in fact, and looking at reading for Ardeshir's keen eye for history is one of those issues to keep in mind, and indeed close looking and visual analysis of lines, of forms, of visual markers on pages, of the way in which he attends to the page. He uses the sort of thickness and thinness of the light line. He uses the pen and the ink. He uses the negative space and the positive space and so forth in each of his works are crucially important for our understanding or fuller understanding of his work. And unfortunately, it seems to me at least, that we haven't attended to that sufficiently. I also wanted to point to the fact that without making any claim that he or any contemporary or modern and contemporary artist is looking directly as the work of artists in the past, that knowledge is part of the collective heritage that he, amongst others, are in fact privy to. In other words, a visual cultural history, a landscape, if you will, a visual field that artists had access to, and works of great masters of the history of Iran, such as Sultan Muhammad, one of the greatest artists of the Safavid period, where in a painting, a famous painting titled by one of the collectors as allegory of worldly and otherworldly drunkenness, which has nothing to do actually with whether this painting was meant to be such an allegory, but that it actually depicts something of the sort of out-of-body experience that the figures of diverse backgrounds in this painting represent to us, including presumably Hafez the poet seated in this balcony above the tavern, in fact, with eyes that are blurry from drunkenness. This is drunkenness of a worldly nature, but also drunkenness of a spiritual nature, probably. And then all these strange figures that look like Qalandar, maybe like skinheads of the time, and the sort of ecstatic nature of this, all of which introduce us to a historical location of observations, satirical, if you will, commentary of human behavior, human nature, and so forth. Others, such as these paintings from an album of Persian costumes and animals, which sounds like a very straightforward thing, made by an artist we know as Johnny. We don't know much about him as an artist, but one whose work was commissioned by the German physician and a member of the Swedish embassy, Engelbert Kempfer. This album includes such bizarre images, which are not so strange if we think about half-naked dancing Qalandar here, or the big mustachioed Qalandar half-naked advising or looking at the young man, the painting on the upper right-hand side, or the juxtaposition of what is called Ravish Qahwe Bazar, the bazaar prostitute, next to a mullah, essentially, sharing the same space. Is this a form of commentary of its time? Is it a sort of a very veiled statement by the artist who knew that the commissioner, Kempfer, had really an interest in just costumes and typologies, but in fact, he seems to be taking a tact of his own in these instances. Johnny's handiwork, in other words, artistic style, is not the issue so much as, for instance, the artistic style of artists such as the famous Reza Abbasi, in whose paintings, particularly drawings, we can trace the hand actually. In other words, here is the artist using a brush, not an ink, and using not a pen, using a brush to create these, what they call calligraphic lines, or thickening and thinning of the lines, creating the volumetric figure, let's say, of the pilgrim as it is considered, and practicing something that actually brings us to think about the tracing of the art, tracings of the artist, something that Mohassess, with his emphasis on line drawings and also his form of signature and commentary on his works, are extraordinarily important indications of an alertness to this historical past. But also, just like Reza Abbasi's Pilgrim, with that funny looking sort of bald head, he lifts his turban, kind of pushes away and ponderingly looks out at somebody. Reza Abbasi tells us that he painted this spontaneously in the company of friends, actually, on a Friday of a certain date. So are other artists like Sadeghi Beg Afshar, who in his drawing of a seated man seems to capture something of perhaps the peculiarity of that figure. These are not portraits, as none of Ardeshir's works, or at least most of them, are not portraits, but encapsulation of a particular type, a mood perhaps, or a particular idiosyncrasy of a person who may not be recognizable. This is also true of the one we know as Nashmi Kamangar, which is Reza Abbasi's, with this face squished tight, with his pot belly, a bandaged ankle, looking really very unusual. Is it comical? Is it satirical? Is it an observation of the sort of the unusual side of human beings, of known people, and those who are typologies of sorts? This kind of hand tracings of the hand, the drawing, the line, which is so highly appreciated in drawings and paintings for albums made primarily or largely in the 17th century, although the practice goes back to the 15th and 16th centuries, but it is really in the 17th century when we find these kinds of line drawings with their sort of sideway look at things. For instance, in all three of these drawings, what we are seeing are a form of dalliance, if you will. Two young boys, one of them trying to get his hand into the sash or pants of the other one, as it seems, and plant a kiss on his lips while the other one is pulling away, or the rude gesture of this older man looking at the younger boy, turning back to him, or in fact, what is supposed to be Shah Abbas and a page boy with its very obvious evocations of a sexual, perhaps, encounter, not ever in a physical manner, although there are pornographic images, but in all of these, a sense of the humor, a commentary, but maybe even something of a sense of social, perhaps, jibes or stabs at the surrounding world that we see in 17th century, as an example. And it seems to me that Ardeshir was especially alert to that body of work that we understand from album paintings and artists of the Safavid period who produced for albums. Here I have, and you have to excuse me for very bad images of Ardeshir's work. I had no choice but to take phone pictures from a book that I have at home to at least supplement some of the images that become available. And this is a real issue here. I underscore it for the very fact that we need to remedy the difficulty of access to his work and a proper seeing of his work. Here I want to point to the fact that this drawing of a bald man from the back of his head makes me think of the incredible sensitivity of observation that Mohassess brings to such subjects. It's as if I'm given the look at the back of the bald head of the pilgrim by Reza Abbasi, or this figure on the upper right-hand side with that very funny-looking, sinuous turn of his whole body with the head highlighted in comparison to the thinning of the body, or the very sharply observed vulture on the lower side of the slides, all of which indicating a command of the pen and ink and of line and space, and this idea of playing with the location of the image on the page that are his style and his language. And we curiously are still lacking in better understanding of what that means actually. And finally, I want to finish with this tinted, if you will, drawing, which is something I came across at an exhibition in London. Unfortunately, the best images at hand are the ones I took with my phone, these two pictures. And what really triggered my interest in Mohassess's ability and interest and access to these pasts, and how it is done, I don't know. I still don't know. I would be so keen to learn more about it. Is his in this drawing very clearly he states that the figure of the mouse, seated mouse, drawing on his piece of paper the portrait of the cat is this one, he says, is Beshive Mu'in Mozaffari, in the style of Mu'in Mozaffari. And this one, he writes Beshive yek digar az naqashan. Someone, in fact, whose work resembles the work of artists in second half of 17th century, who had gone to India, Mughal India, and returned and introduced a new style. And in fact, this distinction he makes between two different styles is an important part of this. And the other point that is very obvious, and I know that a lot of people have written or pointed to this, including and most importantly, Ismail Khoei, is the references to the Mushogorbe of Obeid Zakani, this versified political satire of the post-Mongol era in Iran, which in fact points to the sort of hypocrisies of the clergy in a moment that is so incredibly meaningful for us. What I wanted to do is put these together. He talks about Shive Mu'in Mozaffari. He's referring, in fact, to this painting by Mu'in Mozaffari, in which his inscription on the side of the album page indicates what he's doing, which is to paint a portrait of his master, Reza Abbasi, and there is a reference to having done this long after the death of his master, his teacher, and he signs and dates it. And indeed, he depicts Reza Abbasi with the sort of instruments of his craft in front of him, just as Ardeshir references to the bottle of ink in front with an additional pen on the ground. and painting his subject. The subject of Reza Abbasi in the painting that he's holding on his lap is invisible in this drawing, but it is in fact a well-known painting, as Reza had made these very popular standing figures of men holding various objects, in this case, a vase, actually, a kind of a wine bottle, if you will. And Mohassess seems to be looking at this, but turning it into something of a different commentary. In other words, the historical is fully available, but also understood by Mohassess, and then recast in light of the, now Reza Abbasi is the clever mouse, turns to us with his little spectacles on his nose as he paints the figure of his oppressor, the cat, in what is a very dainty looking oppressor after all. That's where I want to finish, by pointing out to this, to these different aspects of Mohassess's work that needs to be foregrounded, in my view. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Babaie, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure afterwards we will have the chance to talk more about it and go into details. I'm not sure if Dr. Mozaffari is with us. I cannot see her, but I don't know. But maybe we can continue with you, Mr. Mahlouji, until we will have Dr. Mozaffari again on the panel.
As you wish, we could, I could go on with some comments that I wanted to put to today's panel. You let me know if that's what we should do.
I think we can start having a conversation about the points that we saw in the presentation by Dr. Babaie, and then if any time Dr. Mozaffari joins us, maybe we can continue with that. But
if I wanted to respond to,
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, let me. I have some things that I've prepared that I'm very keen to bring to the panel today for discussion, to see what we can, what questions we can raise about Ardeshir Mohassess. But to begin with, if I pick up where a few points that Dr. Babaie brought up, which also link to my work in my archaeology of the final decade, with the platform I'm engaged in, is indeed the question of preserving, archiving, and making accessible the works. Ardeshir Mohassess is a very good and prime example of a cultural practitioner whose work is very well known, especially at home, and also because of his work in New York, also to some extent in the US. But it deserves a lot more study, and obviously it merits collating, archiving, publishing, scanning, and making available. So I think I have contact with the foundation regarding that. And I think that it is very important that we manage to do that in order to be able to further studies on Ardeshir Mohassess's work, and then venture further to define him. The question of defining him as an artist, as an illustrator, as a satirist, or a caricaturist, I think is still very open. I've been looking at his work and thinking about the panel today, and I would refrain from labeling him very easily in any of those categories, even though there are large overlaps between them. So I think we hope that these panels will galvanize some interest in Ardeshir Mohassess's work, and that we are able to find some kind of funding to help the foundation to further the archiving and the collating, making an inventory, scanning and making available, and basically having a policy as to how his work can be disseminated, and also, of course, putting some of his work into important institutions.
Thank you. Sorry
Dr.
to interrupt
Mozaffari
you, but I
isn't there,
think, yes, I think we are joined by Dr. Mozaffari.
Perfect.
So maybe we can continue from there, and then after that, we will surely back to the points that you were making. Dr. Mozaffari, if you hear me, and if you're ready, I can start sharing your presentation.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, we had a huge rainstorm in New York, and unfortunately, I live in a very old part of the city, and out went my internet. I apologize. First, I would like to express my condolences and solidarity with Mahsa Amini's family, Iranian women, and everyone who is protesting in Iran. The title of my presentation is Historical Cultural Context, 5 Sketches in Words on Mohassess. As a historian, I feel inspired to speak about Mohassess's art because it is deeply informed and influenced by history and politics, with the wit, the humor, and tragedy in his work is touching and thought-provoking for the observer, regardless of profession. I was introduced to Ardeshir Mohassess by his friend and admirer, Behruz Moazzami, in the 1990s in New York. I've been a fan ever since. Thank you, Professor Moazzami. So sketch number 1 relates to the critique of tyranny through exposing and ridiculing its brutality. The first work of Mohassess that I ever saw was the book published in France in 1988 called Comment peut-on être iranien? The title immediately attracted my attention because I recognized it as a slight modification of the most famous line from Montesquieu's work, The Persian Letters, Comment peut-on être persan, or How can one be Persian? I looked inside the book, and as the drawings of Ardeshir Mohassess unfolded before my eyes, page after page, simple yet complex, tragic, hilarious, and deeply perceptive, I was captivated. Why did Mohassess select a title inspired by Montesquieu's Persian Letters? Montesquieu's book was published anonymously in Holland in 1721. It was the story of 2 intellectually curious Persian gentlemen, Özbek and Rika, who traveled from Isfahan through Europe and France and recounted their observations through letters to their friends, wives, and the eunuchs in charge of their harems at home. Montesquieu used the Persian gentlemen as outsiders with a critical and comedic, ironic gaze towards what they observed in Europe, particularly the institutions of despotism, the hypocrisy of the court, and the ridiculous exhibitionist mannerisms of the upper classes. Montesquieu drew a parallel between the absolutism prevailing under Louis XIV and the tyrannical politics of Özbek's harem, which was ruled by a complex combination of personal and political despotism and undercurrents of violence and passion. It occurred to me that Mohassess, as artist and public intellectual, constructs a persona of the critical outsider in his art to do much the same, to dissect and critique the recurring circles of despotism, violence, and injustice made possible through the manipulation of the majority, through the generation of fear and ignorance, through the stoking of materialism, through the perpetuation of outdated beliefs, superstitions, and conventions. In Montesquieu, as in many works by Mohassess, relationships often revolved around the physical and institutionalized tyranny of the master. And this pattern of abuse of the powerless by the powerful was repeated among all groups in society. Cruelty and greed among most of the wealthy and powerful, and the prevalence of fear and ignorance among the majority allowed the system based on tyranny to prevail. Like Montesquieu in the Persian letters, Mohassess has a profoundly political vision combined with a remarkable talent to administer his critique through irony and satire. He undermines his subjects of critique by making them look ridiculous. Mohassess was, as the writer of his New York Times obituary stated on October 20th, 2008, an artist of surrealistic satire. Sketch number 2, Precedents in Iran. Mohassess has been one of the few Iranian artists who was at the same time profoundly Iranian, a Rashti, as Professor Chelkowski put it, and an artist with a global vision and reach that speaks to and confronts the human condition anywhere. Injustice, brutality, violence, and abuse of power, irony, and hypocrisy are universal. Mohassess's art directly invokes these realities, but most poignantly in its Iranian context. Ardeshir was born in 1938 in Rasht, the city where 20 years before his birth, Isa Sadiq, fresh from his studies in France and Britain, had established a modern system of elementary and secondary public education. By the time Ardeshir reached school age, the secular state education system had expanded considerably. He grew up in an educated family. His mother was a poet, his father was a judge, and showed a passion for drawing when he was very young. Either through his family or his formal education, he was possibly exposed to the great poets of Iran like Obeid Zakani, who used satire and mockery as a way of undermining the legitimacy of the existing order. In the 2 generations before Ardeshir, in the late Qajar era, poets like Iraj Mirza and Sayyid Ashrafuddin Gilani continued this time-honored tradition. Many of the newly established newspapers of the constitutional period, such as Kashgul, Mullah Nasruddin, Sur Israfil, and Nasim Shomal, combined articles, poetry, drawings, and cartoons to inform and arouse the public about the necessity of political and social reform. As Shiva Balaghi has pointed out, in late Qajar Iran, the lines between literacy and oral culture were more blurred. In other words, as the literacy rate was very low, the constitutionalist writers and reformers used multiple genres from political essays to street poetry and caricatures to communicate complex political notions and goals to the population. The drawings that appeared in Kashgul, the poetry that appeared in Nasim Shomal, or the Charan Paran column in Sur Israfil, written by Deh Khuda, helped to bridge the gap between the literate and the illiterate. The poetry and cartoons further helped the critics express themselves with irony, innuendo, and in some ways be protected from the wrath of the despots and their enforcers, though many a writer or artist did end up in trouble with the authorities. I don't want to go into a detailed history of the critical press in the constitutional era, but I do want to point out that the particular style of Mohassess, which combines the critique of tyranny with irony and ridicule, does have a worthy precedent in many of these publications. Excuse me. I would like to focus on one case in particular, one that I'm most familiar with, but that also has much in common with the vision of Mohassess, and that is the Charan Paran column in Sur Israfil. The vignettes in the Charan Paran columns were the sites where De Khuda deconstructed the state of mind and the types of practices which he deemed unjust or obstructive to the successful transformation of culture from what it was to modernity. Selecting and setting up certain absurdities, he then attacked who was responsible for the absurdity, thereby undermining his legitimacy. De Khuda's cast of characters, such as Kablai Dakho, Berehne Khoshhal, Nokhod Hame Ash, Kharmagas, and Sage Hassan Dale, all inhabit a world of heightened absurdity, reflecting real problems and injustices. Kablai Dakho, who appears often, is a traveler who learns a lot from the sciences in the course of his travels. He exposes corruption and the double crossing of the people by the despot, his underlings, and the ulama. This character represents De Khuda himself, the knowledgeable observer who is honest and courageous in the face of power, to the point of stupidity. Like Mohassess, who appears in many of his drawings, most of the satirical pieces are written from the perspective of Kablai Dakho. Through these characters and the situations they're put in, the injustices are accentuated to the point of arousing common indignation. Similar to the drawings of Mohassess, the Charan Paran articles, seen as a whole, create a pageant, a carnival of the absurd, allowing the breakdown of hierarchies as well as fear. The presence of many poor people and other victims of injustice, the constant, almost exaggerated use of street language and popular colloquialisms reflect De Khuda's desire to be a voice for those who did not possess one. I suspect that Mohassess felt the same. In the atmosphere of relative intellectual freedom and diversity of thought that existed between the abdication of Reza Shah in 1941 and the coup against Mossadegh in 1953, Mohassess read a great deal and was deeply influenced by the work of Sadegh Hidayat. He later studied politics and law at the University of Tehran, but drawing remained his passion. He began to publish his drawings in various newspapers. The atmosphere of repression that followed the coup, as well as the growing power of the monarch in the years that followed, made a huge impact on Ardeshir's perception of politics and the human condition in Iran. He witnessed what Jean-Pierre Cliquet calls the farce of modernization through the experience and observations of the White Revolution. And by that term, Cliquet means a certain kind of superficial modernization that is accompanied by tyrannical force and a great deal of pomp and circumstance. Mohassess observed an increasingly militarized, bureaucratized society, driven by materialism and a dumbed-down pop culture, ridiculous inaugurations and commemorations, fabricated idols, the coronation in 1967, the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. These events and facts are the historical background to Mohassess's drawings on the workings of tyranny in that period. His characters address in the Qajar past to mislead the contemporary censor and the police, but the allusions and depictions of torture and repression clearly convey the stark realities of Iran in the 1960s and 70s. Ardeshir provides clues as well. The long nose, according to Cliquet, suggests Mohammad Reza Shah, but most telling are the titles of the pieces that connect these drawings to the present. See, the king personally oversees the execution of the Shah was personally and politically offended by this art. Soon, no journal dared publish Ardeshir's work, and by 1976, he moved to New York. Despite the high hopes that accompanied the early stages of the revolution, he, like the rest of us, witnessed the rise of the next version of tyranny, one that reached into every aspect of public and private lives. Torture, assassinations, and the crushing of any dissent, mass executions, war and its atrocities followed. In his characteristic way, Mohassess continued to observe and draw, mixing tragedy with absurdity, and exposing and protesting the truth. Sketch number 3, literary and artistic precedents in the West. The mocking of injustice and violence as critique has a long history in the West as well. I won't go back to Greek and Roman times in the interest of time, but we'll mention a few artists and writers who preceded Mohassess, but shared a mental geography with him. I must begin with mentioning the publication of 2 classical and daring books of the Renaissance period, The Praise of Folly by Erasmus and Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais. The Praise of Folly, written by Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, was printed in 1511. It is written from the point of view of folly, masquerading as a sense of doubt and skeptical questioning, particularly of religious and political dogma. Gargantua and Pantagruel, published by Rabelais in 1532, is a parody of both medieval and Renaissance ideals in order to cope with the dislocations of that transitional period. It is the literary work that critics such as Bakhtin later analyzed as carnivalesque. The notion of the carnival existing as a social institution with a social function. In this book, Rabelais uses what is later called grotesque realism as a literary mode to express social and political criticism. I'll come back to Bakhtin's interesting critique in a moment. Candide, written by Voltaire in 1759, is a satire of the philosophy of optimism. It too contains grotesque realism, as all manner of unimaginably horrible things happen to the main character. Yet he continues to plod along, observing, recording, reporting, and ridiculing evil. Honoré Daumier, a 19th century French printmaker, caricaturist, painter, and sculptor, whose art Ardeshir admired, offered critical commentary on social and political life in France in the period of King Louis-Philippe in the 1830s. In this satirical cartoon, Gargantua, remember Rabelais, Daumier showed King Louis-Philippe as a greedy monster who is devouring all of France's wealth and food. He was imprisoned for 6 months for this drawing. Daumier contributed to Le Charivari, a satirical journal that reportedly had much to do with the downfall of Louis-Philippe. Skipping Goya and Picasso, I would finally like to mention Saul Steinberg of The New Yorker, an artist that Ardeshir is often compared to in the United States. Here we can see some of his work, which has the satire, irony, tension, and in a sense, sadness and chaos that we see in Ardeshir's art. According to the text introducing the Steinberg Foundation, the idea of disguise is central to Steinberg's art. In the world as he saw it, everyone wears a mask, whether real or metaphor. Sketch number 4, Mikhail Bakhtin and the Carnivalesque. As I mentioned before in relation to his analysis of Rabelais, Mikhail Bakhtin was a Russian scholar and a literary critic. His work first became known in the West in relation to to his critique of Saussurean structuralism. He believed in the dialogue between text and context. According to Bakhtin, certain kinds of literature or art take on the characteristics of a carnival, in that first, there is no clear-cut division between performer and audience, and everyone participates actively. Think of Ardeshir or a face that resembles his in many of his drawings. Second, the usual laws, rules, regulations, power relations, economic and social, even age hierarchies, along with the corresponding considerations, such as fear and etiquette, do not apply in a carnival atmosphere. It is a world turned upside down. With the breakdown of all hierarchies and fear, a freedom of expression ensues, where barriers between the sacred and the profane, high and low, great and petty, wise and stupid, break down. And fourth, all this leads to a certain profanation, the freedom to be obscene, to parody and critique, which is considered sacred in normal life. Excuse me, to critique what is considered sacred in normal life. Bakhtin claims that these features of the carnival have been transposed into literature and art and are most distinguishable in the genre of satire. So it's not surprising to read this about Mohassess in his New York obituary. His images were preternaturally disturbing. The Shah dangles from a noose over a sour-faced mob in turbans. A comically dilapidated aircraft strafes praying citizens. A turbaned figure draws a picture of his own amputated feet, which rests on pedestals created by his own surreally upturned lower legs. Captions were acidly caustic. The convict's execution coincided with the king's birthday ceremonies, one said. And the last sketch I have is sketch number 5, and it concerns women. Finally, I'd like to make a few remarks about how Mohassess depicted women. It is remarkable how present and almost overpowering women are in his work. This may be due to the early love, respect, and influence that he shared with his mother. It may also reflect the reality that a generation of women energetically came out of the private sphere and became very active in society, and this period coincided with Mohassess's growth and maturation. Another reason is that he was prone to be a voice for the voiceless in his work, and women have much more voice in his drawings than they did in society at large, notwithstanding the educated and active women like his mother. But Ardeshir also saw the uglier side of women as he did of men. He was not into idealizing anyone. He saw the propensities in our society for women to be manipulated into becoming silly fashion or pop icons, religious fanatics, or superstitious carriers of outdated beliefs and practices. I found his depiction of women very interesting and ambiguous. Sometimes he himself appeared as a woman in his drawings. This would be a good topic for discussion later because I am raising questions more than answering them in this regard. Can we see the slide of, oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. So though I've talked about certain historical and cultural precedents, about other kindred souls who, despite vast geographical, cultural, and temporal differences, had similar marginal and oppositional perspectives, Ardeshir was a unique personality and a unique artist. We can observe his personal presence in his work, the mixture of joy and pain, the irony, the mixture of the political and the personal, his deliberate marginality as a good position from which he could not only observe and record society's ugliness, tyranny, violence, greed, hypocrisy, injustice, and ignorance, but question and undermine such givens through satire and carnivalization. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next. Yeah. This is one of his depictions of women that I was very interested in. It doesn't have a title, but I think we see a resemblance between Ardeshir's own face and this woman's face. And then this depiction of Hazrat Abbas happily courting a blushing Venus de Milo is a fine example of the carnivalization of realities and myths by Ardeshir Mohassess. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I think we can turn on our cameras. Yes, thank you. Also, Dr. Babaie, it would be great if you could turn on your camera. Okay, before we start, I wanted to apologize, Mr. Mahlouji, for interrupting you later on, but I'm sure now you can start. The stage is yours. I'm afraid I cannot hear you. I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Raha. Well, thank you very much to both our speakers, Dr. Babaie and Dr. Mozaffari. It's certainly given me a lot to think about. And I think quite a lot of stuff has been discussed, which is very interesting. I have some notes that I wanted to put to our panel and our discussion today. If there are a few areas I wanted to touch on. One is his reputation and his position in our visual culture. Secondly, Mohassess's personal visions, his personal inspirations. Then the question of categorization, how we categorize his work, and the question of interpretation that follows from that. Some thought around existentialism or absurdism. And finally, something that I've been interested in bringing in are facts and remarks about his biographical background, his also psychological and psychoanalytic makeup, which is a potentially tricky area to talk about, but I have found through my own research that it's very important to take those considerations into account. So firstly, the reputation, it's we're all clear, I think, and from the talks we have had today, that is possibly we are easily in a position to evaluate Ardeshir's practice as one of the most valuable lenses onto society, a deeply socially engaged practice on account of his personal and political free spirit, I call it, and we can speak about that more, or otherwise, at least on account of his razor-sharp sensibility and his ability to simultaneously zoom out into a wide-angle view and focus in minutely on the human condition in its bared form. The breadth of his work is wide, and it's spread over a long and unbroken span of many decades. Ardeshir Mohassess was well known from early on in his home country, especially among artistic, literary, and intellectual circles. Much of his early work was published in the media. He was hailed by many of his contemporaries for excelling in what he did. A significant exhibition was mounted early on in his career in Tehran. I haven't found out who organized it, or in modern parlance, who curated the exhibition, or whether it was self-generated. Nevertheless, it seems to me that it was a bold decision to exhibit reproductions of his work in large formats, so they were not the original works as far as I understand, and to present them not as part as an artistic medium of visual making demanding its own space. Despite his success, however, I think his oeuvre remains still under evaluated, underexposed, and perhaps even under-recognized in the larger field of visual culture. I think his artistic output deserves further study. As I said, compiling, archiving, cataloging, perhaps a catalog raisonné. I think these are really art historical necessities. Secondly, about personal visions, his wry social satire or social/anthropological commentary reflect, in my view, upon almost every aspect and every tenet of life, work, society, and social relations. In my interpretation, evaluation of Mohassess, I refrain somewhat from a purely political angle from him, precisely because I see that his view is, as Dr. Mozaffari said, in the carnivalesque and the grotesque, I think spans the entire spectrum of human and individual and social relations and the human condition. So I sort of have a tendency to focus less on strictly political in the sense that we understand it, especially in the Iranian context. I would describe it in line with modernist critiques of the fortitudes and the pretensions of class, the elite, the modern state in general, equality, welfare, and the urban bourgeoisie, all issues that come to the fore with the creation of the modern state and are generally fraught questions of modernism per se as a whole anywhere. He interestingly, effortlessly links the relative refinements of modernism or the modern citizen to the relative crudity of a feudal past, archaic ceremonies of monarchy and court, of servant and master, and of decay. So we see, for example, a lady speaker speaking to a crowd of women who clearly can't bear the shrill of her voice any longer. We have studies of popular cafes with the roughies watching the fat cabaret dancers, fat singers and acrobats, skinny onlookers, run-downness, steamy and sweaty environments. We see studies of mental health patients, the anguish, the realness of the characters that jump off the page, surround us with their pleading eyes and overwhelming thoughts, communicate with us their slow and degrading lives. We see studies in the miniature style depicting never-ending wars, whether it's the Khyber Pass or Vietnam. We see the hollowness of war everywhere, throughout human civilization, the seriousness of historical inevitability, I would call it, in his work, and the vacuousness and meaninglessness of intentions. Then thirdly, raising the question of categorization and of interpretation, which also leads us to the questions of understanding or reading of intentionality. I see his work more than mere subversion, more than ridicule, more than satire. I agree with our speakers about grief and disgust. I see a lot of that in it. And the grotesque realism that Dr. Mozaffari mentioned is very much on my own mind, and also the Bakhtinesque carnival or the carnivalesque. I call it the loneliness of existence. I think he was sensitively masterful at elucidating existential anguish, feelings of bitter shame, feelings of utter disgust. He was masterful at pulling off the veil of illusion everywhere. And he leaves us with a disconcerting sense. The reader, the observer, like his characters, with all our social graces, our personas, our self-images, our defenses, might be just as hollow as the tin pot heroes depicted on his page, or the dispossessed marginal characters. His world, I would venture to say, is almost the antithesis of a conspiratorial view of life in its naked clarity and real, sharp and decisive intention to hold up the mirror to the truth behind the pretense or the mask. I'm interested in the viewer as a witness. I think as viewers, we would be uncomfortable feigning the position of a passive victim. The truth about life as it really is far from ordered and logical, or even pretty or pleasant. The truth is neither pretty nor obvious, but it is there if you look, and it is not easy to absolve oneself from inevitable complicity. He was certainly most able to implicate the viewer, in my view, as witness in his critique. I find his work full of mindful sharpness, less provocative than disconcerting. In terms of the question of the existential and the absurd, I think perhaps, as has been discussed today, in certain ways it may derive from or be linked to or propel forth from particular forms of Iranian existentialism. And in other ways, in my view, we can see it in the context of mid-century modernist forms of existential critique of society, order, and life in general. And that is a much broader area of social critique within the modernist trajectory between skepticism and rationalism. I think in this case, it's clear from all accounts about him that his own modesty, his withdrawn, solitary, quiet, observant demeanor, on the one hand, and his unassuming social and non-party political stance set him apart from two ends of the spectrum. One, the commercially inclined expansion of the artistic production of the 1970s, 60s, and 70s in Iran, and two, a dogmatic, politically, how can I say this? I've said sort of the left-leaning political commitments that retrospectively we may now evaluate as somewhat dogmatic, or at least dichotomously rigid or inflexible. I wouldn't place Ardeshir Mohassess or his output into that context personally. I became very interested in biographical notes, which is my final point, because I interviewed some of Ardeshir Mohassess's friends from childhood, from elementary school. By all account, he was always reclusive, even as an 8-9-year-old. He refrained from games. He didn't take part in play. He hardly spoke. He was always overweight. He didn't engage socially. He hardly ever laughed. He didn't engage in any debates. He was a man of few words, as we know. He's known as an adult as a soft-spoken person. He remains unmarried. He lived in solitude. He refrained from intimate, sexual, or familiar relationships. He was reclusive, gushegir in Persian, we would say. It is very interesting that he studied law at the University of Tehran. I think it's an interesting biographical fact. We may find a link between his sense of justice, his social conscience, his razor-sharp social and personal observations, his ability to set up dramatic conflict, in my view, an argument, a point of focus, and I think collapsing, in his case, judge, jury, and witness in the face of an event or a dramatic scenario. Always, of course, inexhaustible at showing exhaustion as pomp, ceremony, and declamations. I also wanted to discuss with our panel today that the biographical is interesting to me due to my own psychoanalytic background, that there is a bitter view on life in general, and that I would be interested in finding more out about his personality, because I think that there is, I think Ardeshir Mohassess, from talking to his close friends, had a sense of himself as rather, I wouldn't want to say grotesque, but certainly not as one of the others. But not, I don't mean it in this intellectual way. I mean it in a much more deeply psychological way. So I think his marginality is a much deeper personal issue than just a political stance. And that's just my last comment. So I'd like to open it to any other conversations from our panels, and I'd really welcome any comments you may have.
I guess we can start our videos, but I'm receiving this message that I'm unable to start a video. I don't know why, but if Dr. Mozaffari and Dr. Babaie, you can start your video, it would be great if you can engage in the conversation
either.
with. Okay, I don't know, maybe it's a technical issue or something. I'm trying to fix it.
It says the host has stopped it.
Okay.
Ah, okay.
Oh, now it's working. Yes, Dr. Mozaffari, if you could also. So thank you, Mr. Mahlouji. Any comments, any feedbacks on the remarks made by Mr. Mahlouji?
I have a question. You mentioned an Iranian existentialism when you were discussing Mohassess. I'm curious to know what your definition of an Iranian existentialism is.
That's a very good point. It's something that I wouldn't be able to define. In fact, it's one of the, I think these are questions that are, with Ardeshir Mohassess, that are very interesting for us to all look at. But my own sense of, for example, Sadegh Hedayat is a kind of very different is a very kind of different sensibility to what the Europeans call existentialism. So in the absence of any other term that I could find in Persian, I'm using, and that's why I'm bringing up the question of existential or absurdist, as in how do we define those similar kinds of trajectories or visions of upon the human condition in our own cultural sphere. I don't know if you know of any Persian terms that describe absurdism in the way that we understand it. I mean, absurdism is in itself very important because the Albert Camus sort of definition of the absurd isn't the absurdity of life. It is more the fact that we inherently know life is meaningless, and yet we look for meaning. It's much more complex than life is absurd. And I can see that more in Mohassess's work, that he is implicated himself as we are. So I tend to refrain from a kind of dichotomy of power and powerless so much in him, that the powerful is in a sense absurd, as is the powerless. And even the fight for power almost is absurd. The first Anjuman of women or of the first girls' school, everything seems absurd. That we thrive and we sort of struggle to give meaning, to give space, to give power to ourselves, where we know even having power is somewhat meaningless. That's more where I see Mohassess coming from. A sort of total question, a total disdain for everything. That even the good is questionable.
Your parallel with Sadegh Hedayat is very apt, I think, because in many ways he did in his writing a very similar thing. Yeah. Thank you. That was.
Could I ask a question from both Vali and Dr. Mozaffari about the I think in both cases, there is at least an implicit statement about modernity and extra-Iranian, if I may call it, context of both comparative and referential approaches. And this is not, of course, absurd or anything to be worried about, except for the fact that the first thing that we tend to do is to think about the ways in which we can compare these artists, writers, and thinkers with a European context to begin with, as the model of thinking. Hardly ever, and I think Vali and I have had this conversation at some other point, but hardly ever looking, for instance, to India or to China for models of parallel models. And there is a tendency to think of the West as the source or prime source and not further east. But even more concerning, as far as I'm concerned, is a kind of an unspoken agreement that nothing in our own historical, or the artists and thinkers and poets and so forth in their own historical context can be part of the analysis, if you will. So it's like museums are European an invention. That may very well be the case as an institution, but collecting is not a European invention. Wanting to, for instance, display one's grandeur through works of art or collection of artists and poets and thinkers is not a European idea to begin with. So the question really is about, do we always need to look at Western models in order to explain the particularities of artists such as Mohassess and authors and so forth, with the understanding, of course, that many were in fact very closely related to, like Hidayat, for instance, closely connected with European context as well. But nevertheless, I'm always puzzled at the very sort of natural way that we tend to look west for the sources and explanations.
I could come in on that, if I may. Well, actually, Hidayat published which one of his books he published in India, actually, yes, that he couldn't publish in Iran. He published it in India. So there is, of course, yes. But I mean, as you were speaking, Sussan, I had inevitably, because as you know, I'm very interested in Asia. And in my work around contemporary art, I'm very keen to connect the Iranian sphere to the Asian sphere. But it is also true to say that we are talking about periods in history where colonial intervention meant that millennia of relationships directly between Iran and the subcontinent had to be mitigated via London. There is a historical reality why we are severed, and we are very severed today, even more severed today than we were in the 60s. I mean, due to Sunni Shia, the whole politics of religion, oil, and everything else that's going on. But it is also true that prior to that, there was much more free flow of information, of artistic practice, of architecture, of gardens, of trade and language, in fact, than there is now. I mean, the Pakistani national anthem is in the Persian language.
Yeah.
And as the Pakistanis have less and less knowledge of the Persian language, i.e., within 2 generations, the elite literate classes of Pakistan no longer learn Persian. This has only happened since my grandparents' time. So as we go on, we are even more severed. So I think there is a real historical background to why we automatically connect to the West. And of course, people like Sadiq had lived in Paris. He's buried in Paris. So there's also a reality that, so I just wanted to put it in the context of real historical changes. And one of the things we're trying to undo now is to have direct connections between our cultural practices, our cultural institutions, and those of Asia, if we can.
Yeah, I just wanted to, if I may, just add a footnote to that. The point is not whether, and indeed you're right, absolutely, the colonial intervention makes the connection between Iran and India through London. But that's not entirely the story, actually. And it's also, it's much more complicated, I think, than we have given it credit. But more than that, my point is my responsibility to, in fact, look not at the 60s, but at that longer, sort of deeper history that would allow for the sort of rising of those sediments, if you will, seemingly sedimental material, which go back to that deeper history and deeper alertness or consciousness about those pasts. So whatever happened in the 60s or 70s should not, or God forbid, after 1979, should kind of put that wall in between, at least for the historian.
Mm.
That's what I'm asking. Please, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Of course, you're right. In fact, in some of my courses that I teach on Iranian history, I deliberately, and there isn't much material on it, deliberately assign interactions between Iran and Japan, Iran and China in the 19th century, but there isn't much of that going on. And in fact, what happened with Iranian intellectuals, even from the mid-19th century, was you had two categories. Some who believed that we should adopt Western modernity as it is completely, and others who felt, no, Western modernity has its problems, so we have to take pieces of it that we like and adapt to the Iranian situation. So there weren't many people looking. There was the Talibov translated the Meiji, the Constitution of Japan, and there was a lot of talk in Iran about how clever the Japanese are because they beat the Russians in 1905. But aside from that, there was less of an interaction during the colonial period, and even by Iranian intellectuals themselves. One interesting comment comes to my mind. Rabindranath Tagore traveled to Iran in 1933, and I am revising a paper that I wrote about this trip because Tagore wanted to say, let's have an Asian modernity, let's construct it, let's not, and with a lot of people that he spoke to in Iran, they said, no, like our model is the United States. They didn't want Britain so much because they were suffering from British intervention. But France was nicer. The United States was nicer. So there were a lot of the intellectuals, even into the 30s, had their views of modernity based on Western modernity. I'm hoping that as historians now, and I take your point very seriously, we have to start looking at the interactions that were taking place and write about them and study them.
Mm. Yeah, really digging deeper than what those people have said about their interest, yes, to really sort of uncover the remaining traces of those Asian connections. Transasia's is a subject well worth looking at in a historical context. Right. And regardless of what the individual might say, there is a historical sort of operation here that is not necessarily reduced to the comments of and writings of a few. That's the point, in the end, at least, to my mind.
Okay, thank you.
Also, I wanted to say
If you
something
agree, I
about that,
think,
if I may, Raha. Could I
okay,
just say
yes,
something
but
about that?
I would like to go back again to the first lectures, but after you, of course.
Okay. Yes, I think it's a very, I think all the comments are very interesting. I think we don't want to set up a them and us. You know, the Europeans are not, you know, I certainly refuse to allow myself to create a kind of a binary which is in contradiction to each other. But at the same time, I think it's still interesting when we think about Ardeshir Mohassess, for me, at least at this point of my knowledge in him and about him, he is critiquing the modern condition, and that modern condition is very much a European, you know, whatever, is inherited in terms of institutions, in terms of nation state, in terms of a central government. There's a lot of that. And then at the same time, as I said in my short outline, he effortlessly brings in the archaic forms of Iranian monarchy, Iranian pomp, Iranian ceremony. But at the same time, he's also critiquing the institution of this and the institution of that. So I think it's good to bear in mind that Ardeshir Mohassess is you know, across the spectrum of looking at our own archaic forms and then the introduced modernist versions of state or of institutionalization.
Thank you. Okay, I just wanted to point out to our audience that if you have any questions, you can just write down them here, and we can, of course, discuss them here. In the second lecture by Dr. Mozaffari, you mentioned the similarities between work of Mohassess with Dekhoda and juxtapose his work with the constitutionalist writer's text. Now, I want to point out to another aspect of constitutional era and its visual culture, photography. And I also have some photos which I can like later on share them with you. You know that we have many group portraits in this constitutional era, which kind of resemble the portraits that we have from Dutch Golden Age, Regentenstukken, if you have heard of them. So basically group portraits. I just want to know that we know that these two eras and their visual culture have something in common, and that is perhaps the spirit of community and the idea of the group versus the individual. Going back to Mohassess' work, we see a vivid allusions to constitutional era group portraits in some of his works. I want to know what aspects of these portraits, these photographs, are reflected in these drawings, and how the artist's critical perspective is represented in them. I can share some photos. Maybe we can, while looking at them, we can actually talk about them. So I don't know if you see my screen.
Yes.
I think you do, right? Okay. So you see on the left, you have one of these group portraits that I was referring to, Syndicate of Merchants, and then on the right, one of the drawings that Dr. Mozaffari showed. What are the similarities? How can we read and actually see the parallels between the two? I don't know if Dr. Babaie or Dr. Mozaffari, either of you.
Well, obviously there's a similarity, and I think he's similar to the portraits of, you know, the new organization of women, or the new organizations of birth control. You know, do you remember that one, the ladies congregating for birth control?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can actually see that here. We have it here.
Face in the corner. Similar to that, I think he's commenting about major changes that started with the constitutional period, of different groupings of people becoming visible, other than the court and, becoming organized. Yes, see, there's Ardeshir. Can you see in the corner?
Yeah.
Anyway, he's showing elements of change that are occurring in both these cases, and new groupings of people, like a hotel is a new thing. So people congregate to see the hotel, and that the merchants getting together and expressing their own views and interests, it was also a new thing that came with the constitutional period. So having said that, I think this points to the anthropological in Mohassess's work, and also the absurdity of everything. That's my comment as far as I can figure out.
Thank you, Dr. Babaie. Any comment on that? And do you basically think that such comparisons are valid?
You mean between the group portraits of the 19th century or the constitutional period and
basically
Mohassess's
the group portraits that we have from the constitutional era and the group portraits that we see in Mohassess drawings?
Yeah, of course, those are the point. The point is that he is aware of them, and he understands their functionality, their particular role as visual material representative of the particular developments of the time. The constitutional period is extremely important in that regard. I don't see that as the formations, for instance, of these groups, interest groups, if you will, to be unique to either the European context that you mentioned or the emergence of the constitutional period, but its forms are different forms. We know of guilds from earlier centuries in Iran and their representation, their structures, their sort of the way in which the guild itself makes itself known. Modes of communication are different. And the role of, for instance, painting in Dutch society is very different from the role of painting in Persian society, say of 17th century. And this is not to say one is better than the other, or one is more advanced than the other, or one is more complex than the other. It's simply to say these are different ways of representing and communicating, essentially, the particular notions of presence, absence of groups. And I find, the formation of a state in the modern notions of state, in fact, related to nationalism, the formation of a nation state is even more important to consider than a centralized, for instance, authority of the state. I don't see them as problematic in terms of comparing, say, Qajar material with what Mohassess does. That's perfectly agreeable. What I do wonder about is that he is in New York when he's doing these things. He is, looking back at material. I mean, everything of this material from 1889 to 2008, all of it is post-revolution, but it's mostly looking at the Qajar visual sort of repertoire to represent a new form of tyranny, if you will. So his game is very complicated, and I don't think we can reduce it to, at least that's my understanding of it. And I don't know enough to be able to say anything with confidence, really, but that he really has a very complicated relationship with his own past and his own present. In fact, I think Vali pointed out to the complex psychoanalytic nature of the man, if you will, something that needs to be done, in fact.
Thank you. We know, of course, that Mohassess was one of the artists that when he was active, there has been many texts written about him and his work by the intellectuals of the time. So, and mostly these texts are not necessarily engaged with the visual aspects of Mohassess' work. They are more like political, like engaged with political ideas and so on and so forth. But interestingly, in one of the texts that Jawad Mujabi writes about Mohassess' work, he briefly engages with some visual aspects of his work. In a review of his work, Jawad Mujabi mentions the relationship between Ardeshir's work and the visual heritage of Persian painting. He argues that what connects Ardeshir's work to the Iranian visual tradition is represented in the practice of folkloric images. He's talking about Qahwakhane paintings. Now, my question is that if such references basically exist, are they directly borrowed from coffee house paintings, or are they referring to the original sources, such as lithographic illustrations of the Qajar paintings? You know, like obviously Mujabi sees something, some resemblance between Ardeshir's work and what we can see in Qahwakhane paintings. Today, we didn't necessarily maybe have the chance to take a look at those kind of works. But what do you think about this? What is Mujabi talking about? I don't know, Vali, Dr. Mozaffari, Dr. Babaie.
I thought that Dr. Babaie's presentation was very enlightening for me, because she took us back to way before the Qajar period, and how, you know, how the line and the some of the absurdity. I love that painting of the allegory of drunkenness. I think, you know, so I think that Mujabi's, the thing is that I think Ardeshir was very aware and used images from a lot of different periods of Iranian history, and from the Safavid period onwards. And he was using these symbols for his own purposes. He was inspired by them, and then he turned them into what he wanted to express. So I think Mujabi has a point that yes, Qajar, Qahwakhane drawings were also inspirational for him, but he was also inspired by Safavid art, and then, you know, by some elements of Western art. So I think that's point is true, but then we should expand it to other periods.
Could I just add a little note here? I think I'm thinking a lot about the fact that the tendency to go back to we go back to the constitutional period. That's enough of deep history, or to the Qajar period. We did it. The point is that in reality, history of modern Iran begins with the Safavids, with the declaration of Shiism as the religion of the state. Whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, given the circumstances of current regime in Iran, that's not to deny the historical fact that if we know of an Iran as such, in the geography even, the boundaries of today, it is because of the transformations of the Safavid period. So from the beginning of the 16th century, we really have a delineation of an identity, not of a country, but of a realm, if you will, of a form of state that is centralizing, that it is declaring itself different from the neighbors. And this is really important, that Iran was surrounded by powerful, wealthy Sunni empires. So the Safavid Empire, which has been questioned whether it's an empire or not, and I tend to think it is, and it was, is really the source of what we might call a national identity. And it really bears fruit to look back deeper than our early 20th century or 19th century interest, and to really look at the Safavid period very seriously. I'm a Safavid historian. It's natural for me to, beat my chest for the Safavids, despite the dislike of everything having to do with what they established these days. But it's part of the history that makes us who we are today.
Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions from the audience, because now we have almost 15 minutes for the Q&A section. But if not, I really want to just be visually engaged with the works, because we really didn't have the chance to do so today. I'm going to again share my screen with you, and then maybe we will. Okay, just let me know if you see my screen.
This is mine.
You see this change of power, yes?
Yes.
Yes, this is one of the slides that you had in your presentation, Dr. Mozaffari, but we really didn't have the chance to look at it, because it's very important. After all, when we are talking about artworks, we need to talk about them. Yeah. So you talked about the role and representation of women in Ardeshir's work, and you mentioned this several times today. In a piece, this piece is actually somewhere else is entitled "Booty from Niavaran Palace After the Takeover, 1979." So maybe this work has two titles. Which I guess we also we couldn't really see, like didn't have the chance to visually engage with it. The presence of a particular headscarf and like chador that this woman is wearing with like indicates that this woman's hijab is probably not traditional, but as a more ideological base. And then on the other hand, we see that on her right hand, she's holding a scepter, and there is a rifle on her shoulder. In the picture, we see only her profile, which makes one even think about the archaic representations in ancient times. She's heading to the front with a rather determined face, and it's depicted in a walking position. What does this approach towards the presentation, together with the title, reveal about Ardeshir's work and his position on women's role in politics? We know that this, like the date of this work, says that it's been executed during the time of Iranian Revolution. How can we read this picture? Basically, is my question.
I mean, I tend to see a lot of his work more from a political, I mean, not all of it, trust me, but I tend to see the political aspects of his work quite a bit. And I think this is obviously shows the change of regime, but from one tyranny to the other. This also shows a certain power in this new ideological Islamic model of tyranny, more power for women. She's carrying a gun. And so, I mean, this is what this one I see as a political statement about, well, if you thought things were improving, think again. You know, this image, this woman's image is quite frightening. If you take your eyes off the mace or the scepter, it scares me because it reminds me of the morality police, you know? And that's when I was saying that he has a very ambiguous vision of women, is that he doesn't idealize every image of women that he has. This is a particularly frightening one.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question about this point Dr. Mozaffari just made about he doesn't always idealize the image of the women. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure if he idealizes anyone, and women in particular.
No, I think I mentioned, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mentioned that in my talk, that he's not into idealizing, but he is, women are quite prominent in his repertoire. And so that he represents them through his art, or he shows his interpretation of them through his art a lot, although he's not idealizing.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, this requires a lot more working with the objects and closer analysis. But I actually wonder if there is any kindness towards them. I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts on this one. I mean, looking at the works themselves.
Any kindness towards women or anyone?
Yeah, women in particular.
Mm-hmm.
The visual representations, in other words, is there any that conveys a sense of sympathy, maybe? I don't know how to put it. This is the absence of empathy, maybe.
I think the one that I showed that as a nude, that's kind of a soft representation.
I don't know. As an art historian, I see it differently, I must say,
Really?
having seen a lot of nude female figures in history of painting with the blonde hair.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
very odd, isn't it?
It's very unusual, very, very unusual. And if you look at it carefully, there's another woman besides her.
This picture, or are you talking about the nude?
The nude.
No, the nude that Dr. Mozaffari showed us at the end of her presentation. I wonder, for instance, could one put this this work in a comparative context with work of Shirin Neshat, and then think again? The Women of Allah series.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Mahlouji, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm going to go back to my my own comments on Ardeshir Mohassess. And for me, this is a perfect example of what I was saying, was that his ability to set up a dramatic conflict, an argument, a point of focus, collapsing judge, jury, and witness in the face of an event or dramatic scenario. For me, this is, when I look at that, I can see not the absurdity, but the kind of tragic turn of, you can see the elements, the scepter, the gun, the chador. I mean, there's too much symbolism already in that. It doesn't need for me to go back either to miniatures or forward to Shirin. It in itself is what it is. Of course it does. Of course, I mean, there are photographs of women marching like that. So his use of photography must, I mean, I'm actually quite curious to know about whether he ever referenced photography, because in my own imagination, he does. I mean, we have exactly those kind of photographs of women marching. So even in this case, let alone the Qajar or the pre-Qajar periods. But for me, I'm less engaged with where the image is referencing, or what the image is referencing, rather than what the image is saying. And what it's saying is is not just absurd, it's very tragic. The sense of monarchy, violence, women freed but in chador, an active, as you said, woman walking, the sort of tragic complexity of the condition we're living in. I just would rather sort of be a little bit refrain from too much interpretation. I think his titles are enough, and I think in line with his own sort of mutedness, where the image is a mirror for me, a mirror to society. I don't find myself pulled to connect it to anything else. but to the society I'm living in, mainly, foremost to the condition I'm living in. The women now burning their veils, we haven't even been able to have a slogan to support the women of Iran burning their veil. That is how complicated our real condition is. It's not symbolic, it's not where the image comes from, but it's the reality we're living in right now. So I sort of tend to stand back from interpretation too much, but rather like meditating on it in a sense. Because I think if he wanted to say it in words, he would say more. But the image is saying something really complex, and it's neither about women nor about the Shah, and not even about tyranny for me. I actually kind of move away from the notion of one tyranny to another. I don't see that in this. I see the collapse of everything, in a sense, into a reality which is very close to what we visually see, which makes no sense. I don't know whether I'm making any, I'm able to communicate what I'm trying to say, but what I see is a tragic scene of something that actually doesn't make sense. I'm trying to make sense of it if I think one tyranny leads to another, but that's actually not what has happened in Iran, in my view anyway. It's much more tragic than that. And this image is much more complex than either about a woman or about an active, proactive woman who's in a chador, or about some kind of Islamic feminism, or about power. I think is much more complex. And in that sense, much more real. That the real life is more fictitious than fiction. Is that sort of thing. I think it's far more grave than either being about a woman or about tyranny.
Thank you. Indeed.
Sorry, I don't want to put an end to conversation, but yeah. I don't know what my colleagues how they might respond to what I say, but that's where I think that the question of interpretation with Mohassess's work, I would be very careful about our interpretations, our readings into the work, and I think the work is, in a sense, more powerful.
Can I say something in response? I think this has been one of the great benefits of this panel, because you're looking at it from the point of view of an art curator, specialist. Sussan is looking at it from the point of view of an art historian and a historian. And I'm looking at it, the reason why I get more clamped down into the political and the personal and the anthropological is I'm looking at it from the point of view of a historian who's not trained in art at all, But this speaks to me. I think it speaks to all of us in different ways. And I've really enjoyed hearing both of your interpretations. And
if I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. And
I just wanted to say what you reference is the significance and the compelling need for transdisciplinary thinking.
Exactly.
To look at things from different angles. None of this collapses into one category or another, one interpretation or another, one narrative or another. There can only be those complexities that interweave. And ultimately, none of our so-called solutions or answers are sufficient. So in so many ways, all of what can be said about any of these works may be valid or invalid unless we come up with some kind of a convergence of or a consensus that can historically hold the argument. But this is not to deny how important and complex the image itself is. It's to say that it's made up of many things, including all those that you talked about, Dr. Mozaffari, all those that you talked about, Vali, and in fact, all that I talked about, and many more that we haven't even touched upon, obviously.
I mean, I was thinking about my comment about the Albert Camus definition of absurdism is our march forward in spite of our inherent knowledge of the meaninglessness of how we are here, what the world is about. And in fact, this is a victorious Shia, if you like, woman of conviction, who's prepared to fight for something that she's convinced about with her rifle. She's even got the symbol of power in her hands, and she's marching. But where to? What for?
Right.
I kind of prefer to see it in that context more. Okay, you've got this now, a woman in chador with all your conviction, with power, with conviction to kill even, and you've got this, and you're marching. And where to?
To defend the baiser of Islam.
Well, I think that's where he's sort of saying, okay, so you've got this now.
Yes.
And now what?
I'm somewhat.
And this is precisely where we're living, actually. It's kind of very, there's foresight in this, like this is where we are,
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we don't have much time anymore. If there is any final point that you want to mention, otherwise we can wrap it up.
Well, I wanted to thank all of you organizers. It was a very, very enjoyable panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you from me too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for giving us this opportunity. Thanks again for joining this panel discussion. A special thanks to panelists, Dr. Babaie, Dr. Mozaffari, and Mr. Mahlouji. As I mentioned in the beginning of the session, this session will be uploaded on Ardeshir Mohassess Trust YouTube channel, and you can have access to it. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.